Avatar was released in 2009 and was directed by James Cameron and stars Sam Worthington, Zoe Saldana, Stephen Lang, and Sigourney Weaver, and follows a paraplegic Marine who is dispatched to the alien moon of Pandora on a unique mission, but soon becomes torn between following his orders and protecting the world he sees as his new home. Avatar is one of those films that I think rides the line between overrated for some and underrated for others, depending upon who you ask. There are a lot of differing opinions about this film, but it cannot be denied the impact it had on audiences on a worldwide scale. Before Avatar, Titanic was the highest grossing film of all time, and Avatar since then has maintained that spot since it was released in 2009. Only being beaten by Avengers Endgame before eventually gaining that title of highest grossing film with several releases during COVID. It also provided several huge advancements in technology, from the use of fully CGI worlds and motion capturing to the groundbreaking 3D, which still has not been able to be recreated by any other film that has come out since. However, though Avatar was a big deal when it originally released, and the money proves the impact it had, recent years the film has received more and more backlash from people criticizing its simple story, and I think unfairly comparing it to films with similar messages, themes, and stories, such as Dances with Wolves, Pocahontas, and Ferngully. The use of 3D was something that also became a huge part of the movies that came out afterwards, by having options to watch a film in 2D or 3D for a few extra dollars. But there are some who think that overall Avatar left very little of an impact, believing that there really is no interest in seeing all the sequels that James Cameron has planned, because in the eyes of some of these people, everyone knows that Avatar isn't as good as people say. But with the recent re-release of this film, the amount of money that it has made thus far, I think it shows that people are very much interested in Avatar and its sequels, and I am happy to be among those people that are excited. Let me first give some backstory on my experience with this film. I saw the film when it was initially released in 3D, and it was one of the best experiences I had ever had in a theater. The story was simple enough to understand, the world was interesting, the Na'vi, who have a lot of similarities to Native Americans, a decision that was done on purpose, and the visuals themselves were something I really needed to experience. The film came just at the right time for me, as I was just beginning to grow in my appreciation of film, and so movies like Avatar, Inception, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises were so important to me, as I realized I wanted to make and write movies from that point on. However, when the film was finally released for the home, I watched the film and I still loved it, but clearly something was missing, and a lot of people that have seen the film and loved it initially have had this very same experience. It was clear the film just wasn't as good as it was seeing it in the theater, the way it was meant to be seen. So over the years, I began hearing people's opinion on the film, which seemed to be more and more negative, criticizing the film for being simple, bland, and really not giving us anything new. Pocahontas with blue people is what people called it. And for many years I believed, but I still liked the film overall. I just felt that maybe some of these people were right, and it wasn't as good as I remember. I was just a kid when I saw it anyway, but with this recent re-release of the film, I knew it was time to finally experience the film in the theater once again, and the experience I had was one of the greatest experiences I've ever had in a movie theater. I fell back in love with Avatar, which is something I never thought I would ever say. I bought into some of the negativity the film got from people that just wrote it off and still write it off as something underwhelming or not as good as they say. I just cannot agree with this anymore because a lot of the problems people have with the film are problems you could even attribute to Cameron's previous film, Titanic, which is one of my favorite films of all time. Both films are at their core simple stories with characters that are not the most well-defined or three-dimensional, but they are given just enough to make them compelling. The villains are stereotypes, the dialogue is cheesy, but Cameron is a master of taking these elements and making something compelling. Both films are spectacles, beautifully filmed and simple enough to understand that anyone can pull something from it. That's why I think Avatar is far more than just a retelling of stories we've seen before with cliched characters and tropes that have been reused time and time again. It is all of these things, but the film is aware of that, and so was Titanic. So I find it so weird that this film doesn't get the pass that Titanic does. Avatar is always going to be one of those landmark films that I think by talking about the film's simplicities, we aren't getting anything out of it. I believe that everything Cameron did was an intentional decision to create a film that could appeal to anyone, and I think that's why Avatar works, and its simplicities in character and story are non-complaints. Yes, Avatar is a film that we have seen time and time again, but those other films that people bring up, Dances with Wolves and Pocahontas, are also stories that have been told time and time again. What sets Avatar apart is the way the story is presented, on the largest scale possible, by telling the story of humanity's future that looks so much like our past, that shows in the end we have learned nothing. But before we get into my full thoughts on the film, I want to briefly go over some of the things that went on behind the scenes. James Cameron conceived the idea for Avatar in an 80-page story outline he wrote back in 1994 when he pulled from pretty much every science fiction story he had ever read, as well as the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs, where I think the film gets most of its influence from. After the release of Titanic, Cameron said that Avatar would be his next film, but it would take several years until the technology needed for the film developed enough for Cameron to use. Cameron would begin working on the script in 2006, and he paid a lot of attention to creating the culture of the Na'vi, which would be central to the film. Creating a lexicon of around 1,000 terms, Weta Digital, which had worked on the Lord of the Rings trilogy and King Kong, began collaborating with Cameron to create the world of Pandora. The film also implemented the use of high-tech 3D cameras, which helped to bring the world to life. When it came to the themes of the story, Cameron wanted to tell a story with an environmental message and cited the stories of Edgar Rice Burroughs, Dances with Wolves, and even Princess Mononoke as influences on the story. Many of these influences is what the film ended up being criticized for, but I think it shows this type of story has been told before and is worth retelling from new and different perspectives. Cameron veterans such as James Horner would go on to develop the film's soundtrack, and Sigourney Weaver returned to play one of the film's central roles. So, with that out of the way, let's get into my thoughts on the actual film. In December 2006, Cameron described Avatar as a futuristic tale set on a planet 200 years hence, an old-fashioned jungle adventure with an environmental conscience that aspires to a mythic level of storytelling. Avatar is a fairy tale in the same way something like Star Wars is a fairy tale based on the hero's journey. James Cameron was inspired by Avatar through many different works to create something that was very familiar but could stand on its own. So much like Star Wars, which pulled inspiration from Kurosawa films and old Flash Gordon serials, Avatar is influenced by films that hold some kind of environmental message or deal with a heroic figure learning about another culture. It's by looking at the film like this, I cannot criticize Avatar for telling a similar story to something like Dances with Wolves or Princess Mononoke. I feel like this criticism is very lazy because there's nothing wrong with a film borrowing or being influenced by something else, as many films are. So, in my eyes, Avatar's story is completely fine, and after learning about many of the influences I wasn't aware of, I can now see just what Cameron was going for. Now, I will admit, I won't be the first person to say that the story for Avatar is overly simple, but I think it was designed that way on purpose. By telling a simple story, you're able to welcome a wide audience, but I think the story, much like something with Titanic, is able to get away with this approach to a simple story by creating a world and a people to be invested in. The Na'vi, I think, are one of James Cameron's greatest creations, as they evoke many of the themes and ideas of the film and are close to Cameron's heart, as they are part of his own thoughts on how we should treat the environment and the world around us. Cameron populates the story with characters that are not the most fleshed out, but each one showcases traits of some kind of trope. You have the hardened general that spouts cliche dialogue. You have the jarhead that uses his hands more than his brain. You have the scientist nerd who is the comic relief. The list goes on. These are archetypes as characters, and I think it adds perfectly to the idea that this is a fable with a lesson to be learned by the end. However, even though I enjoy most of the characters, Stephen Lang is always a delight, and his villain is wonderfully one-note and over the top. Sigourney Weaver as Grace Augustine is snappy with attitude, and even Sam Worthington as Jake Sully, though kind of bland, I think gets the job done, playing the type of character he is supposed to be. But in the end, my favorite character has to be Neytiri, who I believe to be the heart of the film. Zoe Saldana, I believe, does such a great job of making this character likable and believable. James Horner's soundtrack is also fantastic and is probably my favorite of his, right behind Titanic. It has so much scale and weight to it and makes some of the film's biggest moments just that much more grand. The scene where they reveal the floating mountains of Pandora is one of these great moments where you're just in awe, which is brought about not only by the music, but the visual effects as well. Now it's time to finally talk about the one thing everyone knows Avatar for, and that is the visuals. This is one of the best looking films I have seen, and I'm so glad I got the chance to see it again in a big surround sound theater in 3D and 4K. Everything in the film looks beautiful. The visuals, the vistas, the environments, the creatures, and the Na'vi themselves look like you could just go up to them and touch them. The night scenes on Pandora are some of my favorite parts of the film and look really good in the 3D format. I told my girlfriend after we saw the film that this movie makes a case for purchasing a 3D TV. This film has aged incredibly well, and from the footage I've seen of Avatar 2, it seems the sequel will continue to have excellent visuals. I feel when people bring up Avatar, they are always too focused on explaining how it's like every other film that they have ever seen, and they just gloss over or flat out ignore the more interesting aspects of the film. My favorite part, however, has to deal with the themes and the Na'vi's connection with the world around them. Everything on Pandora is connected through an energy that binds them all together, and this energy they call their deity Awa. It's a lot like the Force in Star Wars, but in combining this idea with the environmental messaging, it makes for a very complementary pair. Avatar is a futuristic tale with many lessons, and I think by telling a story like Dances with Wolves or Pocahontas, it is having a large discussion about man's place in the universe. Avatar evokes images of colonization in the New World, and Cameron depicts Pandora as that new world, and we see once again that even through all our terrible history and hope that we might not repeat it, the world of Avatar shows that we may very well be doing just that. What the white man did to the New World, encroaching on Native American land, it can happen again. And that's what I take away from Avatar. When I went in to see this movie again for this re-release, I knew I was going to enjoy it, but I didn't know how much I would. I knew that I wanted to experience it the way I did when I first saw it in 2009, and I ended up getting that very experience, and a whole lot more. I started watching the movie, and as it started, for the first 30 minutes, I was a little nervous. The film had cheesy cliche dialogue, tropes, and cliche characters I had seen time and time again, but eventually that just didn't matter. The film took me by the hand and wrapped me up in its world to where these cheesy lines and cliches were just part of what the film was, and I think that's okay. There are moments throughout the film where I was brought to tears from not just the story and the visuals, but I felt like I was back in 2009 again, watching Avatar again for the first time, and being transported to another world I could get invested in despite the world telling me that there's nothing to the film Avatar. I found something, and it reignited a love I have for this film that I think will never go away. Avatar, especially on this most recent re-release, is one of the greatest films I think I have ever seen. What some see as shortcomings, I see as the film's triumphs. And I hope my love for this film continues even when I have to resort to seeing it on the small screen. But I am also hopeful that I can see this film again in the future on the big screen along with its sequels. Something I failed to mention in my initial review was my thoughts on the extended edition of Avatar. I have since then rewatched the extended edition, and I have to say that it is now my preferred version of this film. I love the theatrical cut, but the extended edition adds about 16 more minutes of footage that adds some really good things for a few of the characters. We get some more insight into Grace's life, especially her time developing the school that she ran for the Na'vi. And then also we get some information on Neytiri's sister, who apparently died in a raid that Grace talks about. But my favorite scene has to be one that focuses on the death of Sute, who is a character I failed to mention in my review, who you get this bit of understanding between him and Jake Sully by the end of the story, and you see how their relationship has changed and developed as Jake has become part of the Na'vi clan. And I think overall, it is my preferred way of seeing it, and if you can find the extended edition, I say please check out that version. With all that said, though, I'm going to give Avatar a 10 out of 10. If you never saw Avatar in the theater when it was originally released, please, I highly recommend that you find a theater that is playing this re-release, because it is an experience like no other. And even if you don't like the film and everything I said didn't sway you, I still think it's worth seeing, because I do believe Avatar was made for the big screen, not the small screen. And I think that's where it should be viewed. The story is simple, the characters are too, but the ideas and imagination on display are what make Avatar Avatar. Anyway, I want to thank you guys for watching this review. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.